Here we are, episode 26 of the Connect the Dots NYC podcast in the year 2026. Whoa, this must be a sign that this episode is going to be extra special, especially because we're talking with someone who's not just responding to homelessness, but who's redesigning the systems surrounding it. So, without further ado, thank you for joining me today, and let's get started. Caitlin Rose is a homelessness systems leader and housing policy strategist, and the founder and CEO of Pro Housing Partners, where she works with communities and organizations to advance practical, scalable housing solutions through pro-housing policy and systems reform. She currently serves as the CEO of Friendship Service Center, leading organizational growth, expanding services, and helping shape regional and statewide housing policy efforts. Previously, she worked with the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, overseeing large interim housing portfolios, serving thousands of people, and helping scale programs across one of the nation's largest homelessness response systems. With an early background in clinical psychology and direct service work with unhoused youth, Caitlin brings a systems level perspective grounded in human experience, focused on moving communities beyond crisis fronts toward long term housing solutions and prevention. Thank you so much for joining me today, Caitlin Rose.
It's great to be here. I'm so happy to talk with you.
I'm happy to talk with you as well. And I want to start with your background and your personal journey. And so you've worked across nearly every level of the homelessness response system, from direct service to policy leadership. How did you first enter this work and what kept you in it?
Yeah, I think when I was, trying to find my career trajectory and I was going to school, I was interning as a mental health professional. I was really turned off by the idea of having to diagnose people. There's something that felt really uncomfortable to me about that. I understand that that's kind of a part of our clinical system. Um, but I really was more interested in working with people and hearing about the context of their life that was attributing to things that they were struggling with in their personal lives. And one of my first clinical clients was a man who had experienced homelessness for over 20 years. And he was not coming to a community mental health center for any sort of, support around becoming housed. He came into therapy because he was lonely. And it's really, there's a couple of different pathways I could say inspired me to work in this field, but I think connecting with this person and hearing about his life and the way that different things that had happened to him led him to be unsheltered, and the way that he persevered and really created an entire world for himself. He had a shocking amount of community. Um, and he had just this most basic human instinct of wanting to belong and wanting to, find friendship. It just really moved me to really think more deeply about how people are disenfranchised and how that impacts their mental health. And I think homelessness is the most extreme set of those circumstances. But I think we've all experienced feeling excluded and feeling, not clear on what our next steps are and who we can rely on. And so it really opened my eyes to what is a world like where somebody like this thoughtful, intelligent person could be completely disenfranchised for 20 years. Um, and I think that really opened my eyes and made me want to dig a little bit deeper. And so I was actually placed in a drop-in center and street outreach team, where I started really focusing specifically on the unhoused population in Venice Beach, California. And so I moved from that one client to a whole portfolio of people to work with and whose stories I was privileged enough to hear.
And one of the things I love most about this podcast is my ability to connect with other people I've interviewed. I interviewed someone by the name of Kevin Adler a couple episodes ago who mentioned something exactly along the lines of what you had just mentioned called relational poverty, where we lose or you realize that you're homeless not just because of the circumstances that you're in, but because of the relationships that you lose and that you no more have. You don't have that mentor or that friend you can go to. And as humans, we truly are sort of social beings, and being lonely and feeling that you're not included is truly something that is heartbreaking. And so that work and your work especially is extremely important. Now, you started off in clinical psychology and therapy, and you mentioned how you had this one patient that came to you about being lonely. How does that background in clinical psychology and therapy help you now with your current work in housing and homelessness?
I think that being aware of context and thinking a little bit deeper beyond kind of what somebody is immediately presenting with, whether that's in a therapy room or that's somebody coming and seeking homeless services, I think really being able to quickly create a relationship and be thoughtful about the ways to seek more information allows you to be able to wrap people with resources that are more applicable to them than just a kind of blanket referral. It's incredibly stressful and vulnerable to come in and ask for help. And the way that our homeless service system is set up, whether you are in Connecticut or you're in California, you have to divulge a lot of personal information to be able to be determined whether you're eligible or not. And it's a very, despite our best efforts, it's not the most trauma informed experience that you could have. There's so many people with need, and there's so few resources. And so I think being able to sit down with someone and just really address basic need, be able to listen beyond the immediacy of what they're saying, being able to listen without judgment, um, is so important when you're talking to a human being about who they are and what they're looking for. It's incredibly important. And when you're in a high stress environment, it's easy to lose that. But I was very lucky for my primary experiences, my early years in this field, that truly being the job and having a lot of space and latitude to have those conversations.
And you mentioned the similarity between California and Connecticut and how, homelessness, not only in those two places, but across the nation is, not only stigmatized, but when you're telling your story, it can be very, trauma inducing in terms of having to repeat it many, many times. One thing that's been covered multiple times throughout this podcast is the fact that there are many different, solutions or companies, nonprofits, communities that tackle homelessness. However, very rarely are they connected well. And so what ends up happening is that on house individuals end up having to tell their story and retell their story multiple different times. And when it's a story that, may not exactly have all the positives, then it's not a good experience to have to go through again and again. Now,
Right.
as I mentioned, you worked in both Los Angeles and Connecticut, and unfortunately, although there are these similarities across the nation in terms of having to repeat storytelling, what differences have stood out to you in how communities approach homelessness, for example, within Los Angeles and Connecticut?
Yeah. Well, I think, it's almost apples and oranges in some way, right? Los Angeles City and County are a very resourced place to be. They've, over the past 10 years had a lot of local money that they've brought in. It's been a priority because it has been such a growing issue within the municipality. Connecticut has certainly had coordinated response over the past 10 years, but it's just a smaller community and it's less people. We're talking about less than 10,000 people in the state of Connecticut, and we're talking over 70,000 people in Los Angeles County. So I think, Los Angeles has a lot of bureaucracy as far as just the political system and having a weak mayoral system and how some of the decision making gets diffused among council and county. And that can certainly strain how resources are divided. But I think one of the ways that I describe our homelessness crisis is we've been frogs in boiling water. I started in 2009 in Los Angeles. And yeah, I remember our original kind of talking points were that Los Angeles had more people experiencing homelessness than San Francisco, Chicago, and New York combined. And not as a badge of honor, but just that was the reality. We were this place that really had this growing population. There's no distinction at this point. I mean, every major city has a homelessness issue here. And I think that there's been many reasons for that. And I'm happy to kind of dive into some of like the political backstory of decisions that have been made at our federal level and how that's panned out. But I think it's a lot easier to scale solutions when there's less players, there's less people that you're trying to serve. And so I think that Connecticut's been really successful because there's just only so many of us here. It does not take away from the fact that we've got massive wealth disparity in Connecticut as we do in California. Um, but it's really hard to get your footing back when you just have so many people that are unsheltered. And I think that's just been the story, California in general, but certainly in Los Angeles.
And from Los Angeles to Connecticut, you've overseen programs serving thousands of people, whether it's the 10,000 in Connecticut or the over 70,000 in Los Angeles County. Where do homelessness systems most commonly break down, and what are some of those reasons that you talked about previously in your answer?
Yeah, I think when I think about housing and homelessness, it really to me is a loop, right? housing has to be affordable for people to be able to stay in it. And then people can't exit into housing unless it's also affordable. And I think when I'm saying affordable, I'm not necessarily saying capital A affordable, housing that is subsidized or that is kind of given a voucher through some sort of state or federal program. We have a supply issue, and the housing then becomes scarce, which can drive prices up because there's so much competition for really limited resources. So I think that's been really challenging. You can scale a shelter or an emergency response system pretty easily. I mean, we saw that in COVID. We moved heaven and earth to get people inside, isolated in rooms so that they were not congregate settings. But that costs money and they can't stay there forever. Shelter is not a home, it's not housing. People have to have somewhere to go, and I think that's really where things have started to fall apart is post-COVID, eviction moratoriums raised. There is not enough housing for the people that live in this country, and that certainly varies city to city. People don't have anywhere to go, and so it's just perpetuating this trauma because there's just nowhere for people to go, and there's nowhere for people to stay to keep them out of this crisis. There's no incentive to renew an affordable lease if you're seeing that the rents in your community are going up and up. There's an incentive to not renew a lease and to be able to repost that unit and get a higher paying tenant in. I certainly don't think that, landlords are the enemy in this. It's a supply and demand issue, but we're really in a jam right now with so many people that need an affordable place to live, and there's not resources for them.
And as you mentioned, many cities continue expanding shelters and services and have more nonprofits and are trying to come together to fight this issue, but still see homelessness increase. What are we understanding about these solutions? Is it just that we need to work harder to make sort of not cap lowercase a affordability more prevalent, or is there something else that we're misunderstanding?
Great question. I think that I'm troubled by some of the rhetoric that has been coming out around like the system doesn't work. Because that's not true. And I will speak collectively, nationally, we house thousands of people a day through programs or through getting them kind of emergency services and working with them on their own self exits. We do not have the size and scale to be serving the working poor and to be serving now the middle class that's bottoming out. So I think it's not a broken system as far as the homelessness response system. It's a broken political system. We have created a system where the wealth disparities are massive. It's been challenging for people to be able to work and keep their head above water. Um, and we have people that are, house rich, but cash poor. There are a lot of people that we don't even enter in this conversation. They'll pay their rent, but everything else is on a credit card because it's just not sustainable otherwise with the money that they make. So I think the bigger issue is not whether or not the homelessness response system works or not, but are we going to address late stage capitalism and how it has really changed and bottomed out the social safety nets that were put in place 100 years ago? Because they're pretty much eradicated. And I think we're really seeing the failure of that now.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're pointing out is something that has definitely been something I've noticed, which is that right now our homelessness system is very, not preventative at all. In fact, it is very much almost like an emergency room is the metaphor that I've been using, where we're just trying to deal with this ever increasing capacity of unhoused individuals, and it's extremely hard when not only are you trying to deal with, this ever increasing amount, but then you're getting cut out by government funding cuts in for nonprofits, and you have even more people, and then you're adding along with that the working poor and the middle class, as you mentioned, that's bottoming out, along with other policy shifts that aren't making your life any easier. And then on top of all of this, there's this urge now to focus on sort of preventative care and preventative solutions to homelessness, which don't get me wrong, I completely agree with. However, how do you think we need to go about balancing our sort of, the myriad of problems that exist in our current way of dealing with homelessness? Do you think we continue to sort of focus on that emergency room solution and patch up whatever holes are there, or do you think we should shift towards something slightly more preventative?
I think that we've got to keep the emergency room as is, and I love that analogy, and I think you're absolutely right, and I know many of my colleagues love that analogy too, because no one yells at emergency room doctors when the lobby is too full and there's not enough resources, right? Like, they're doing the best they can with what they have, but for some reason, this idea that homeless service providers are just not working hard enough or being nimble enough with resources, and this talking point of why are we spending all this money on homelessness if we still have homelessness? It's just such a misread of the situation. I think as long as people are losing their housing and ending up on the streets, we've got to have a response. And the response, frankly, has to be more robust than it is now. I'm going to speak for most populations. But we have to stop allowing those conditions to even occur. I mean, if we were keeping pace with inflation, minimum wage would be $30 an hour right now. Um, you can't divorce housing from general economic policy. We have since, the mid 80s completely dropped the corporate tax rate. We've completely dropped wealth tax and we have raised taxes on low income people. It's there's the money does not go as far. People are not earning enough. Um, and then we have billionaires somehow. Um, and I think, unfortunately, it is all connected because there is a way that our political system has been shifted to not represent you or me or our neighbors. It is representing corporate interests, and it is very beneficial to have people not making a lot of money and to have scarcity. It's basic wealth hoarding, except it's not just a few of us that are feeling it. It is a whole group of us. Um, and I think that when it comes into housing, I look at the Sun Belt's such a great example of this, like private equity in our housing markets, private equities in our corporations. Everything that we own was once durable and now is built to have to be replaced every year. Um, I don't know why I'm replacing a phone a year. I am very baffled by this. But that's just it's all kind of connected. It is very expensive to be alive. And people are working really hard and just not seeing the returns on that. Um, we don't take care of our people anymore. I mean, some communities have, free childcare, universal pre-K, but we make it really hard for people to be able to work and to be able to have a family and to be able to afford a car. Those are all policy choices that we've allowed to happen. And I think the average person doesn't necessarily kind of know all that or understand all that. I think they feel it. But I don't think they understand that, we've had legislation that's allowed for consolidation of some of our corporate stores, that five grocery companies own 67% of grocery stores. There's no quick fix on making food cheaper, but breaking up the monopoly would sure help. So it's these myriad of issues and they're all connected. And I think for a lot of people it can feel really overwhelming. Where do you start? But I think the start is we have to have politicians that at a municipal level, at a state level, at a federal level, understand that this is within their power. One of the greatest failures that I feel, and I will offend people with this, is we've got nonprofits that say that they're going to end homelessness in their title or in their mission. And it was never their fault or responsibility to end homelessness. We end episodes of homelessness. We do it all the time and often, but we as a sector cannot end homelessness because homelessness is a byproduct of capitalism. We had homelessness before the 80s, but it was a lot less. You can directly trace the spike in homelessness with deregulation of corporations, with lowering corporate tax rates, lowering individual wealth tax. I mean, like it's all there. And I think we're now kind of sitting in this down position, looking like we've failed. We've been wildly successful. We cannot stop the cycle. That is outside of our power and our control.
Yeah, I mean, to respond to one of your initial points, I mean, there's so much effort being put into the homelessness industry right now, and not to discount it has been going on for many decades. And to something you had said that people don't yell at emergency room doctors when when the waiting room is full. That these people are truly doing their best. This this industry, is not one that is, financially luxurious by no means, and it's not one that's particularly glorious. But what it does allow you to do is allow you to, come in day out and put in the hours. And we're so lucky to have, staff members of all the nonprofits that go across, the nation who consistently put in that effort. And the fact that they're, consistently discounted of those hours, and it's just seen as effort put to waste is horrible. I interviewed Ian DeYoung, who
Mhm.
coined this term called the screwed scale. And it was, last year, so this may have changed, but he said we were at a 9.7 out of 10, which for the audience at home is quite high. um, and it's so shocking to me that, you know within the media, it's so easy for people to say that, you aren't doing your work, or we could be doing more, or suggest a solution that hasn't been thought of. When, if you take away the staff members, if you take away the people who are tirelessly putting in work and trying to help this community, we would shoot to a 10, or maybe just break the scale very quickly. um, we are holding on to this. I mean, from my experience and from what I've learned, by a thread. I mean, we are dealing with a crisis that is ever increasing, and we are trying to. The inflow rate is a lot faster than the outflow rate currently, and we're trying to fix that. I want to focus on what you ended with, which was a sort of a statement that homelessness is a sort of byproduct of capitalism. And you went on how that, we've raised, you sort of benefited corporations, and we have a select few billionaires, and everyone else has sort of, um, bear the brunt of their riches, so to speak. I want to see if you could, sort of characterize the sort of causes of homelessness as a byproduct of capitalism to someone who's encountering this issue for the first time. What are the main sort of three that you would pick? I know, we've discussed a myriad of issues, but what for you are those top three?
Top 3 as far as, like, policy issues
Policy
that are
issues.
perpetuating? Um, I think that unfortunately there's no way around it. A free market economy favors those with resources. So I think that a scarce housing market, ultimately, that is the number one barrier in most communities. And there's a lot of people that benefit from a scarce housing market. If you have home ownership, your property values go through the roof when there's not enough places for people to live. So, not all homeowners feel this way, but many homeowners do not fully understand that what they're experiencing as a benefit is actually a detriment within their community. Um, and so there's a de-incentivization for them to want to see more homes brought into their communities. Um, which then just further perpetuates where are we able to build, what communities are going to allow for growth and development. I personally think that could be positive. I think if communities do not want to build, don't fight them on it. Frankly, their childcare systems, their school districts are going to implode at some point. You won't have enough, people to go through the schools, and you're going to have to address this eventually. But I'd rather pick the easier win. Um, but that's one area. If you own property, you are benefiting from this crisis. Um, it also just eliminates a lot of the competition among finding a place to live. It's musical chairs. If you have a scarce market and you've got 10 people for one chair, you are going to go with the person who makes the most money. It's the best security for you as a landlord. I understand that. Um, but in many communities, when you have 1% or less vacancy rate, that's what you're getting. You're getting a lot of applications for the same unit. And so if you have maybe mid-range credit score, or your job isn't the highest paying, um, or you have children, right? They won't discriminate you on paper about that, but like it will all kind of shake out who is the most viable candidate. And so there's just the people that are not selected, will always be people that don't have enough resources. And that's all allowed. I mean, I think we can say, we can't discriminate based on, you know, race or gender or whatever. It happens. And it's not for a first come, first serve market. These are business investments for people. And so they select people based on that. Um, I think the third thing that's definitely, tied to the second, but I think the most controversial, is it's a free market economy. So people can decide to charge whatever they want for rent. Obviously if it's, some sort of like subsidized housing, you have limits, but you can just decide that one day you would like to change the rent on your unit. And if there's market demand for it, good for you, because someone will take that. But it prices a lot of people out of the market, or it puts people that have been able to afford that unit now back in that competition pool trying to find another place to live. I personally had that happen to me. It's not illegal. My unit was sold. My new landlord raised my rent $561 a month. Like I, I I couldn't afford to live there anymore. He didn't do anything to upgrade the property. There's just nothing to tell him no. And I think there's a lot of kind of, begrudging conversations about whether or not there should be tenant protections, but you have to, because that's how it happens. You do not have savings. If you don't have a family member or friend to stay with, you are in a crisis, and it's not illegal. And you probably aren't going to qualify for homelessness services, because if you have any sort of resources, you should be using your own resources to get housed, right? So, um, it really forces people into this panic, and it's all about money and who has it and who doesn't. And again, not, this is not all landlords, but it is some, and it's all in the name of business.
So the people in the middle, those who may not be, you know, all the way down in their sort of dire straits, not to say that their circumstances are irrelevant, but the people who unknowingly will get their rent raised and don't have enough money to pay that, and then don't qualify for those homelessness services, but are by no means, wealthy or middle class, are still trying to struggle day to day from bill to bill. Those are the folks that are really bearing the brunt of the current crisis.
And it's invisible. Those are people that, they might be showing up in the asset limited, the ALICE scores. I know in Connecticut, 50% of our renters are considered cost burdened, um, where they pay 50% or more of their rent, their income towards rent. um, those folks that are not able to spend money in their communities, are not able to afford necessities or be able to go and enjoy, activities that they would. You are maybe safely housed, because that's the priority, right? You'll pay that extra $561 if it means keeping a roof over your head. But the trade-off to be able to do that is also so great. I'm concerned about the future where we have just massive credit card debt. We already know we have a student loan debt crisis that people can't pay down. We already have a credit card debt crisis, but like that will grow if people are not able to manage their basic needs within their income. And housing is the most basic need, and it has just become out of reach for people.
One of the most interesting things about this sort of homelessness conversation, at least for me, is what we've been talking about and really focused on the questions I've been asking you is policy. The policy is what can really make an impact in how we currently deal with homelessness and how we deal with homelessness in the future, and whether or not, forget solve homelessness, but sort of deal with this difference in the inflow and outflow rate. So I want to start with some basic terms I've seen arising in both the media and just policy in general. And the first one is the term pro housing. It's becoming a lot more common. And what does it actually mean in practice, and what is it referring to?
Pro housing to me means that any opportunity to bring creative, diverse, meaningful housing opportunities to a community, I'm all for. That could be single family homes, that could be townhomes, that could be an apartment building, that could be an ADU. I am enthusiastic about bringing homes that people want to live in into the community. Um, to me, it's also a little bit of a turn on the terms YIMBY and NIMBY. I think that those are a little bit reductive. Um, the idea NIMBY not in my backyard, YIMBY yes in my backyard. Those are very, I think, sweeping generalizations. I've met a lot of people that just would describe themselves as YIMBY. Um, but they got a lot of hesitation and questions about, but what is it? Who's gonna live there? I value having a diverse neighborhood. I value being able to talk to different people. Um, I have no concerns about who's moving into my neighborhood or frequenting the supermarket with me. My biggest concern is that people are able to enjoy their lives, because I think that is what we are supposed to have as freedom in this country, that we should be able to enjoy a meaningful life. And I am very concerned that a lot of people are not able to enjoy a meaningful life because they are stressed out about money. So for most of my adult life, I lived in studios. That worked for me. That was fantastic for me. Even a studio is out of reach for some people at this point. So when I say pro housing or pro homes, I think convert that office building. Make it a duplex, make, little SRO style units so that people that just graduated college can be out on their own and pay a little rent and have some independence without having to move back in with their parents, and then have different access to job opportunities. Like, I think that that's fantastic. I don't think that we have to be so restrictive on this idea. Although I think that owning a home is one of the quickest ways to build wealth, I don't think that that's where everybody is right away. And so I think we've got to be able to create more turn in the market where people can identify housing that's going to work for them in places that work for them. And that is seen as the cornerstone of opportunity. There are a lot of people that can't take really great jobs because there's just not housing. And that is an issue that Connecticut's been facing for years. And yet we still have not built the housing that we need to build. Right. So um, I think it's actually a very exciting term, because I think it can be anything that anybody wants it to be. But the answer isn't we don't need any housing here, or we're only going to build this type of housing, because that's just not meeting the needs of constituents.
And obviously pro housing is, as I mentioned, one of the up and coming terms in policy. But one of the main issues I've seen when, sort of getting into homelessness on my own, is that the sort of media narrative concerning it is very sort of one-sided, might I say. There's someone by the name of Mark Horvath, who runs the Invisible People's podcast, who strongly disagrees with the current media narrative concerning homelessness. And the reason I bring this up is because mainly there's a sort of the public is able to sort of turn a blind eye almost to what is going on, and they are obviously exposed whenever there are these big occurrences. For example, I believe it was last month or maybe a couple of months ago, where there's a severe unhoused population that was being removed from Washington D.C. By force. And when these sort of extraneous circumstances are occurring, then they sort of make the public media. But besides that, homelessness is almost sort of left for the columns on the side, so to speak. And so, what are some of these policy conversations that are happening right now within housing and homelessness that the public isn't paying enough attention to, and they should be sort of more prevalent in our media?
I mean, I think Mark is exactly right. I think we are losing the war of the public narrative, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think the main thing is that we have had massive funding influencing criminalization policy and criminalizing homelessness generally. And I think that has been front and center of certainly this administration, but I think it's been a backdrop for a while. Um, there's incentives to criminalizing homelessness. There are people who will make money off of criminalizing homelessness. And I think being able to defend this is a humanistic approach. We need to work together. This cannot be the way that we allow 770,000 Americans to live. Has just not had the same level of sound on their microphone as some of these think tanks and op-eds, and again, policy decisions coming from our federal administration. So I think that that's part of it. I think that our sector has been really stuck to defending our resources and defending, the concept of housing first, which is jargony and people don't even really understand what that is. And I think we're kind of missing the point of, do you or do you not think that people should be jailed because they can't afford housing? Like, I actually think when you just really lay it out there, the average person is going to say, no, that's scary. No. And more than ever, people know people that are experiencing homelessness, whether they've been on the street or they've been in a car or they had to ask to sleep on your couch. People know people that are struggling. I think that in the court of public opinion, we actually have more support than we've garnered. And I think that might just be the resource machine and not having necessarily the same amount of press and people wanting to ask these good questions and, raise this up. But it makes it seem like we're just being silly over here and we're trying to protect this thing that's broken. Like we're trying to save people's lives. We're trying to save people from the crime of being poor. Like that's where we are right now as a sector. That's heartbreaking to be crushed by a counter narrative that's just like, if you can't afford to live, we'll put you in a detention camp and make you work. I mean, that to me is shocking. And that's where we are. And I think that the other piece is exposing that counter narrative. It's not just that, private prisons will benefit from having people be incarcerated. I'm very fearful about the rumors of what will happen in those jails. It is not actually a crime to be poor, but it should be a crime to perpetuate the conditions that allow people to be poor. And that's a hill I'll die on.
That's a good hill to be on. I'll ride it with you, and it's extremely heartbreaking to, I mean, even just the words that you were using and just sort of realization from, walking through the streets of Manhattan or wherever you may reside, and you see people who, it's someone's son or daughter, it's someone else's husband, it could be someone else's sister, someone's long lost friend. They don't deserve to go to jail for that. They don't. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's sometimes and special circumstances but we aren't talking about this. We're talking about the people who have fallen into these circumstances out of reasons that either they can't control or they've made a mistake when they were younger, and now they're living with that, and
Yeah.
we can't help them. We can't, you know, sort of lift them up and make their lives better. I mean, this country was founded upon the idea of helping the other fellow. I mean, then if you want to help the other fellow, then help all your fellows. Don't just help the one who's convenient. Help the one that forces you to, take time and make efforts to, change their life, because that's the one that's worth it. The I don't know the exact statistics. I think you mentioned 770,000, but however many people are sleeping on our streets every night. Um, I I realized, a couple of days ago, um, that I had a snow day, and I was so excited that I have a snow day, and then you get to thinking that like it's a snow day for me might be great because I can sit in my home and relax under the blankets and next to a heater, but someone who's unhoused who has nothing but the freezing cold and the snow to keep them comfort, that's not a relaxing day for them. That's a day of, you know, below 0 temperatures and, frankly, frostbite 9 times out of 10.
Mhm.
And it's it's absolutely heartbreaking, and what shocks me the most is that besides these, ideas that should, play the strings of sympathy among people's hearts, it's so hard to convince them, at least from a media perspective, whether it's how we conduct ourselves in media or it's a resource-based thing. But when it comes to policy and when it comes to making, legislative changes, why is housing policy, so hard to change and so much harder to change than some people expect?
First of all, I apologize, but my cat Valentine wants to participate in the conversation.
That's
So,
okay. That's great.
um, I think it's because people benefit from it. I hate to be that cynical, but I think that there's enough people that benefit from housing scarcity. And I maybe to say it in a less cynical way, they don't understand what it would be like to have different policies be in place. Again, the counter narrative is if you're homeless, you must have done something wrong. Um, and I think that if you are not necessarily understanding of all of the different ways life has become incredibly challenging, Um, I just the empathy well is a little dry, and I think the news and the media doesn't really educate people. If you're lucky enough to benefit from the economy right now, there's no incentive for you to try to understand or even dare to think that you might have to make a change to make people more comfortable. I don't think building housing in your community is going to do a whole lot to make you uncomfortable personally. Um, but I think people don't understand. They don't understand how all the wires are connected. And nobody's really made an ask of them to do something that's going to have this drastic impact. Um, so it becomes this kind of fear-mongering talking point of like, if you build housing that's affordable, a bunch of poor people are going to move into your neighborhood and they might need vouchers and like they're not from your town. I mean, that's a lot of the fear-mongering we hear in Connecticut, and the reality is it's not. It's not people. People aren't coming from anywhere. They've been living in the hotel down the street, spending all of their money on a hotel room so that they can keep their kid in the school district. Like I think we don't have a great counter narrative. And again, I don't think people fully understand the why because we've never really taken time to explain how this has all come to such a boiling point right now.
And don't get me wrong, I love dealing with these sort of ideological conversations about homelessness and actually the lack thereof of ideological conversations because, personally, I don't think there should be one. I think it's a fairly simple debate. But unfortunately, the world we live in spends almost too much time on these conversations, whether it's, constant back and forth in the media and trying to figure out what we should put out and dealing with a counter narrative or, having legislators and politicians, give speeches and pass policies that are grounded in sort of beliefs that are completely unfounded. It gets a bit, tiring, and I mean, I've have probably the least amount of experience in this industry, but I mean, even I can already tell that it really is, it's a story on repeat of random counter narratives that you seem to hear. How does one change that? How does one help policymakers and communities move beyond these ideological debates where we might be losing the media, we might be losing, public support because we're not able to, say what we truly mean and truly focus on practical housing solutions and something slightly more evidentiary based, which might have more power in terms of convincing both the public and politicians.
Yeah. I mean, I think opportunities like this are one way. I think just having a conversation about it and having it, obviously some of the ways I talk about this, I am passionate about this. I'm deeply concerned about my fellow humans. But I've also taken a lot of time to read and study and speak with people far smarter than me to understand how we got here. And so I think being an ambassador for that type of information is really important. My dream would be that we would have, and I hate to make the comparison, but like a playbook of housing, very similar to the way that we've got a playbook on housing and homelessness that's being deployed right now, where we have those talking points connected to communities so that we are able to explain to people what's happening. I can use language that's maybe different than somebody else would, but we should all be talking about the same things. I feel very lucky. I get asked a lot, "Why is this happening? What is this crisis? How did it why?" I take that as a privilege to be able to explain that to people. Um, but we're not all on message in the homelessness and housing sector, and I think that hurts us. I think we've gotta be able to really say, um, "This is what's happening." It doesn't detract from your message that you might run a nonprofit and need, funding and resources. Um, I think it's really valuable for people to understand what is this crisis? What are they giving money towards? What emergency services are you offering? And why is it happening? It really is eye-opening for people to hear some of these things. So, I think that there's the messaging really, I think, needs to come from our sector and it's got to be organized. Um, and again, we don't have lobbying power. We don't have a lot of money over here. So I hate to have to, implore people's kind of hearts on this. But I think there's a business case to make for it too. And a lot of people don't want to talk about, how do we help people make more money? You are not making money if you have a downtown that's full of people experiencing homelessness. They're not contributing in the local economy. They're not bringing tourism in. I mean, you might get away with it in New York or LA, but just like you are so much better served to accommodate the people that are already in your community that are from your town and like get them back to work and get them resources. That is way better money spent than anything on incarceration. It's so much more pro social, but it benefits your local businesses. You want somebody to go in and be able to buy a cup of coffee and a scone, not beg out front because they don't have any money to feed themselves. It's just that's not I don't think those are communities that local business owners want to be a part of. And I think focusing on it and maybe a different angle, I think is also effective.
I mean, you're completely right. I conducted a study a year ago and specifically for Manhattan. And if you take the money that's been spent on sort of trying to deal with the unhoused population, whether it's through, incarceration centers, but even like with normal shelters and drop-in centers and however we spend our money as it comes to homelessness, and you take that versus allowing people who are unhoused to slowly get back to work or maybe come up with their own businesses, which is what I was vying for, a sort of entrepreneurial pathway. One of them is profit because they will make money for the business. They will make money out of their own company. And it's shocking to me because I've like gone through the streets of Manhattan and I've seen firsthand that this might sound like cringy, but these aren't normal people. These are people who have talent, who have skills. There was someone who I was, walking by who, was an incredible artist. There have been other people who are on the trains who are unhoused who ride the subway cars and write poetry. And it's incredible how, if you're able to monetize these things, then all you have is profit versus just a consistent loss of money that is seen when you just spend money on trying to sort of pretend like these people don't exist or deal with them in a way that isn't just.
Yeah.
Now, one thing we talked about earlier was sort of the emergency room metaphor and how we have this emergency room that is dealing with the ever increasing sort of population of homelessness. However, there's another side that we mentioned, which was prevention. And I want to ask you, and this might be a sort of idyllic question, but if you had sort of that one dream homelessness response system from a preventative standpoint, what would it look like? How would it differ from today? And what's that goal? What are we trying to attain
Yeah.
when we sort of maybe not end homelessness, but try to mitigate it?
Yeah. Well, it'd be really cool is if your housing pricing was tied to area median income. That would allow for people to, not that they would never have financial crises, but if you have housing in your community and your community area median income is $45,000 a year, and the housing is all constrained to be around that, if it's a rental unit, it does allow for consistency in the business market. They'll know exactly what they're getting, no more, no less. But it keeps pricing fair, and that, you could look at that in a different way, right? Does it have to be your area median income, or is it just per your income? Like, it's a little stickier because, um, the rich people will always kind of win out. Um, but I think trying to look at cost of living with cost of housing and making that mirror a little bit would do a lot to just give some standardization to things. I think the unpredictability of the housing market is really the most jarring thing for folks. If you're not making a lot of money, if you've got a little bit of debt, if you've got expenses, it's hard to save. And then any crisis can become something that is an episode of homelessness because you're just not able to get on your feet again. So I don't know. To me, that you said idyllic. I think something that really just acknowledges that housing is a human right, and so we've got to help people stay in housing as much as possible. I think something like that. I'm not a very pessimistic person, but I think something like that. The landlord associations would never let that fly. Um, but I think just in general, being able to pay 30% of your income just and leaving it at that would allow people a lot more flexibility in their budgets. Um, I think otherwise, I think, you know, I'm hesitant to say just change the federal definition of homelessness, but I think that we've evolved over the past, certainly over the past 5 or 6 years, but I would argue maybe in the past 15, we've evolved beyond the definition of homelessness. This idea of imminent being you're outside on the street, you're in a car, place not meant for human habitation, shelter, and imminent is that 14-day window. The 14-day window, it's a little flexible. Do you have a notice? Do you have money that'll run out? I mean, there are ways to make it work, but why are we making somebody get to this fever point before we help them? And I understand that that would mean that we're probably giving more flexible resources to more people, but that actually might be the answer. Um, I think we also need, we've got housing tenancy laws. We don't have necessarily legal representation for people and not great education so people even know what their rights are. I know we see a lot of people that they get a notice to quit and they're just out. They've left the unit, they're done. And technically, they're not homeless because they do still have an apartment to go back to. And so you're able to massage those situations. But you know, some landlords also will take advantage of the fact that a tenant doesn't understand the law, and the retaliation of I filed a complaint because I have mold and you haven't addressed it. It's scary. It's a power imbalance. It's scary to be in that back and forth with somebody that could really, mess with your credit score, mess with your ability to get another unit. So I think not having, right to counsel programs kind of universally also can be challenging. Just people don't know who to call and then they come to the homelessness system and we're kind of, just fumbling around trying to figure out how to best help them. And there might be another better resource.
And kind of on the flip side, I asked about the sort of idyllic response system you would have. Now, what are some early warning signs of communities that are heading towards a sort of increased rate of homelessness or homelessness crisis?
Um, I'm sure it can look different in different places, but I think multiple luxury housing buildings will tip me off. Mainly because, you know, if other units are affordable, they will not stay affordable. I'm not a pure I will not kick out anybody out of bed that thinks that supply is the only thing to address in this crisis. I do think we need to build. But when you start building luxury, all of the other little landlords are like, "Well, I wanna put in a marble countertop, so now I can charge 2,200 for a studio." And it just it I've seen it happen in the community I work in now. It just doesn't ever stay where the other units stabilize. They all wanna get into that higher rent. Um, and it can just become a little bit of, those units that were affordable really quickly are going up in rent. Rents are, not, leases are not getting renewed. So that tips me off really quickly. Um, I think also, anytime there's a turn where businesses are like laying people off, whether that's a change in industry, um, again, it's just resource scarcity. A lot of communities, and there's some interesting history here in Connecticut. I mean, we had a lot of manufacturing. Those businesses moved south to a cheaper state. Um, it's hard to get back to work. And so, people that are going to be able to come in to be able to afford these units are going to be people that are maybe able to afford a commute and then take in this affordable housing. And people that are losing their jobs aren't going to be able to get rehoused in their communities, which can cause a lot of displacement too. So those are two kind of initial things that come to my mind.
Now, I kind of sort of like to wrap these podcasts up with a couple of, slightly more lighthearted and more, reflection, future thinking based questions. And the first one I always like to start off with is that, you know, in this case, you've kind of put yourself out as maybe not a pessimist, but, has had a lot of experience in the homelessness industry, and that gives you a certain outlook on whether or not we're going to be able to solve homelessness and how we're going to be able to deal with it in the next couple of years. Despite all of this, I have two main questions. One, what continues to give you hope that we will be able to mitigate it? And two, do you think there will ever come a time where we can solve homelessness, or is it, like you mentioned, simply a byproduct of capitalism that will continue to exist?
Great questions. Um, I'm the type of person where I think all problems are solvable. I think what we're wrestling with is the people that are in power don't want to see that power. And so I think that that's the only thing that kind of makes me feel a little bit like, "Ugh." I think on a federal level, I think we've got a tougher uphill battle. I definitely think communities and states might have better opportunities here. Um, I think that despite everything that I've said, this is really not a right versus left issue. It's not. It's a human issue. And I think people can start to feel a little bit defensive about that. I have plenty of criticisms about Clinton, just as they do about Reagan. But I think that truly we've gotten to a point where it's the rich versus the poor. And I don't the rich I'm talking about billionaires, right? I'm talking really up there. I think that the more that we can put people in office that understand this or wanna understand this and wanna see people thrive, um, I think that we'll be able to change this. I've heard really cool stories about municipalities that just flipped a couple of seats on their city council and completely revolutionized the housing market in their community, and, like, that thrills me. That makes me so excited because I think that's doable. I think some of the stuff happening in New York, I think is palpable. The city of yes, I think an administration that's really wanting to prioritize housing. I think there's no desire for me to punish somebody for having a home or for having resources. I think we just have to figure out how to create policies and put people in office that want to create policies that can allow for opportunity for everybody. And I think I definitely think that that's possible. I see that happening in communities and in places. And there's some, I think, a lot of really cool, interesting things happening, and I think it's not necessarily being connected nationwide. But I think there's definitely ways that we can do it. And I think it is new generations of leadership. I think it's really connecting with community and not relying on corporate donors that then you have to maybe change your morals on what you stand for when you're in office. I think it's up to us to give those $5 recurring donations to politicians we believe in and then hold them accountable. But our politicians work for us. And if we're in a community and we want to see something, it's our obligation to go to their town halls and to be able to speak up. And I do think that there is more political power that we have that we, and I'm just saying we as people who care about people, are not always amassing. And I think that I feel more confident about it on a local and a state level than I do federal right now. But I don't think that I don't think that this is a forever moment. I can't continue to go on if I think about really just what it would look like to live in a techno feudal state where like people just don't have access to basic needs. I just can't think of it. So, um, yeah, I think I'm cautiously optimistic, but I think we need people power in that.
And lastly, for the sort of next generation of leaders, like you had mentioned, who want to work on homelessness solutions or want to be involved in policy and the government and making social change in general, what advice do you give to them as they sort of rise and take on this challenging and ever changing new industry?
Um, I think every question is a question that you should ask. I think that getting access to information, reading the books, formulating your own thoughts, thinking critically is the best way to start to get involved. Um, I think there's a lot of opportunity for volunteering. I think there's a lot of opportunity to get involved, whether that's like in a drive for a place where you could just be able to ask more questions about what they do in their perspective. Um, I think there's definitely, fields of study that are working to address this. Um, but I think the most important piece is if you're curious about it, like follow that curiosity. I would never be sitting here if I didn't just have this spark of curiosity about how this one man, David, lived. Um, and it's given me a whole career trajectory. It's given me so much passion. But I think challenging the status quo and not giving up to the idea that the way that we live now is just the way we'll always have to live. I think, again, we have the ability to shape the world around us. And I think there's such smart, interesting people in the world asking good questions. I think that can help address some of our communication challenges around kind of what's really going on and what we need to do to be able to, bring resources and, equity back to our communities.
Homelessness, a byproduct of capitalism, an issue that can definitely be solved. We just need to, reorient the resources and make sure that they're being used in the right way, in the proper way to deal with the problem and the solution and not benefit others. Thank you so much, Caitlin Rose, for joining me today. I really appreciated both your time and you sharing your experience. It has been an absolute pleasure.
It's been so great to talk to you, Vidal. Thank you so much for having me.